Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And lately I've been rereading Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
And I've been rereading Dorothy Sayers' The Nine Tailors.
So order a drink, pull up a seat, and join us as we talk about those books and more here at the Spouter-Inn. Ho-dee-oh-ho, 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 ho. Oh, I'm so excited to talk about these books with you.
Yeah, me too.
But before we get into the main course, a little aperitif to open the conversation, because a few days ago, I went to a book launch party for the science fiction writer Premi Muhammad, who's a very interesting writer and a very fun person, it turns out, even though her books are very, very depressing, very post-apocalyptic. I read one recently, and maybe 2025 wasn't the right time for me to read it, but that's not to take anything away from the books. But, I was at a book launch again. I haven't been to one in a while, especially one for a novel. And I was thinking about how I don't keep up with the latest novels.
Did you used to? Is that a change for you?
No, I never did. I was never interested in that. I've always been way more interested in things once they get a little dust on them. And, that's true for novels. That's true for music. That when I was a kid in the 80s, my favorite band, the first band that I really listened to a lot when I was a kid, was the Beatles. So a little out of time, not really what I was quote unquote supposed to be listening to at 13.
No,
there I was.
Creepily, me too.
There you go.
So make of that what you will.
And if I watch a movie, it's probably going to be from at least 20 years ago. So no, I've never. There's something about the new that I don't know. Maybe I stay away from it. I'm not sure. What about you?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting thing to think about. I also don't keep up with current fiction. Like occasionally I'll read something, but I'm not methodical about it in any way. I do kind of keep an eye to some extent on kind of current nonfiction, maybe particularly, as you know, like nonfiction by Indigenous writers, which I find super, super interesting. But in general, I'm more of a nonfiction-y kind of person. Like the thing that I tend to keep up with actually is not so much writing as movies. Partly because my son also really loves movies, and it's something we just share and we just love to talk about. Like we're both really interested in kind of taking them apart, a little bit like the way you and I might take apart books. So that I do keep up with.
Yeah, I mean, as we're recording, the Oscars was just a few nights ago, and once again there were 10 Best Picture nominees, and I had seen none of them, which is a normal year for me. It's very rare when I've seen any of them going into Oscar night.
It is impressive in the extent of the lack of watching, right? So
I saw one of the movies that won an award. I saw Flow, which was fantastic.
That's good.
It was really great. But maybe I'll see some of those movies in a few years. They'll be more interesting to me then. Had you seen a lot of them? I don't know.
I had seen a lot of them. And it's a bit like watching sports, watching the Oscars, I mean, there's the pleasurable part of looking at people's clothes, but then the other part is the, rooting for who's going to win. So me and other family members will often print out Oscar ballots and, then there's a hot competition. And this year it was kind of depressing because there were some okay movies, but there's nothing really, really great. Like there's good years and less good years. So.
And you weren't too satisfied with this year.
Yeah, we were kind of collectively kind of grumpy about it, but we're looking forward to next year. There's some great stuff on the horizon. But I did actually see a really interesting movie that is not hot off the presses, but I think it came out in 2023. It's a couple years old. I don't know if you've seen it. It's La Chimera.
No.
It's an Italian movie. And it's set probably in the 1980s, and it's kind of doing two things, one of which I think you'll find very interesting. I don't know, maybe both. One of the things it's doing is telling you about tomb robbers. That is the kind of business of antiquities being looted in Italy, especially from Etruscan and other kinds of early graves, and how there's everyday people who just sort of, dig these things up, and then there's an industry that takes them out into the world and amplifies their value. And I'm kind of interested in provenance research and, that stuff, right? We've talked about it a little bit before. So that dimension of it is really fascinating. Like the way, history is kind of immanent in the landscape at all times. But the other thing it's doing is it has a kind of personal narrative, like the story of some of the protagonists, that's very mythic. It's kind of almost a Orpheus and Eurydice story, but it's very light. It's a very light hand. It's not in your face at all. So it's kind of cool.
I mean, that sounds very good. One of the films from 2024 that I did watch that didn't end up getting nominated, even though I thought it was a contender, was Dahomey.
You said how much you enjoyed that. I haven't seen it yet.
I thought it was really interesting. It's a documentary about some museum pieces being returned to their origin in what is now Benin. And the first half of the movie is like a very process-oriented, like, let us pack these things up and let us look how carefully they're handled and transferred to the new location, while also they give voice to some of the artifacts. There's sort of a voiceover that, from their point of view, that narrates it, which is an interesting thing. And then the second half of the movie is basically just this like meeting of students, of politically active students in Benin, talking about this situation, this repatriation of these artifacts, and how that's like a dozen artifacts out of the thousands that have been stolen, and what this means and what they should do about it, and how and it's just people talking politics, like in a really engaging way, and a really real and grounded way that you don't often see reflected in media. And I found that really gripping.
Yeah. Oh, I'd really like to see that. Yeah, I think that this is a kind of an interest that we both stumbled across. That is this question of provenance, this question of cultural heritage or belongings. That is, there are all these different ways in which you can think about items that belong to a people and have been treated as loot one way or the other, right? And that takes different forms in different places and times. But the kind of reparative work around that, there's a lot happening. Some successful, some less successful. So maybe we could find some way to kind of highlight that in the future.
Well, I will say, I watched the movie both because people were saying some interesting things about it and because I had access to it, but also because I was thinking of you, because this is something that I know you're very interested in. And I thought, I'll watch this because it ties in with the conversations that we've been having. And so, you were the more proximate cause for me to watch this film and engage with it. And,
cool.
So that was neat. That's something that can push me into watching something that just came out.
Yeah, well, that makes me think that it would be really fun sometime in the future to do. I'm thinking of a whole range of nonfiction books I've been reading over the last little while that are about provenance research. One of them that I read a couple of weeks ago is The Medici Conspiracy by Peter Watson and Cecilia Todeschini. And it's an older book, but it came to my attention because I had seen this movie and people had talked about it. And so I finally went and read it. And it's like way too dense. It's way too detailed. It's like a lot of trees and you lose sight of the forest now and then. But the forest is incredibly interesting because it's about exactly this role of museums in particular in this laundering of provenance that was still a problem, but was a really grotesque problem a couple decades ago. And anyway, there's this one book that I think might be a really great choice that focuses on one particular museum in Berlin. And maybe that would be a neat choice for something to do together at some point in the future. But we should definitely put a pin in it and come back to this, because I think this question of provenance and also belongings, I think would be something great to talk about together.
I began to get it through my head that he was most free. And who was to blame for it? Why, me. I couldn't get that out of my conscience, no how nor no way. It got to troubling me, so I couldn't rest. I couldn't stay still in one place. It hadn't ever come home to me before what this thing was that I was doing, but now it did, and it stayed with me and scorched me more and more. I tried to make out to myself that I weren't to blame, because I didn't run Jim off from his rightful owner. But it weren't no use. Conscience up and says every time, but you knowed he was running for his freedom, and you could have paddled ashore and told somebody. That was so. I couldn't get around that no way. That was where it pinched. Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, there's no the, it's just Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, was published about 8 years after the book that it's a sequel to, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. That one does have a the. It's very frustrating. Now, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer is a book that, it has a plot, kind of, but it's mostly a series of little scenes about what life was like back in the day and what children were like back when Mark Twain was a boy, growing up in Missouri in the 1840s. And so we follow Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn and a few other boys as they pretend to be pirates and hide out on an island and get into all sorts of scrapes. And so for the sequel, Twain's original intent was to write Huck Finn's autobiography, from where we left off in Tom Sawyer all the way to Huck's adulthood. But the finished novel, which took years to work out, significantly narrows the scope. It covers only about a year in Huck's life after the end of the previous book. But the central image of the novel, of Huck and a runaway enslaved man named Jim heading down the Mississippi River on a raft seeking freedom, has become iconic. It's made this into one of those novels that people often point to when thinking about what the great American novel might be. Now, I assume you've read this before, Suzanne. How much of it do you remember?
I actually haven't.
Oh.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I read Tom Sawyer and actually really liked it as a kid. Like, I didn't read it cover to cover, but I read large sections of it. And the sections I read a couple different times. And then I didn't read it at all ever again until I glanced back at it just a couple days ago. But Huck Finn, I pulled out as an adult when I'd come across it as like, important American novel. Right? I was like, oh, I should probably take a look at this. And I just bounced right off it. And one reason is because like it's portraying enslaved people in a way that is just really hard to cope with. But also the first person voice I really bounced off of, and in that way, even though it's a sequel to Tom Sawyer, that's in the third person voice. And the first person voice of Huck Finn is really, for some reason, I bounced right off it. And I tried to read it a couple times as an adult, but couldn't get anywhere with it.
Yeah. So Tom Sawyer I read in a children's version with a lot of illustrations, that kind of thing, when I was a kid.
It was cleaned up, I assume.
Yeah. Cleaned up, abridged, all that stuff. So when I reread it just now before I read Huck Finn again, you kept being like, oh yeah, I know this scene. Oh yeah, I know this scene. But like the fact that there was connective tissue between any of these scenes, such as it is, hadn't really stuck with me. But like so many moments were like, oh right, yes, of course. This is the part where, they show up at their funeral, things like that. It's a weird book. and the narrator in that book is like Mark Twain himself. It's this sort of older person who is remembering the good times and making fun of things and cherishing things at the same time. So yeah, so in Huck Finn, we get it told in Huck Finn's voice, and Huck Finn's voice is very voicey. And while Mark Twain does Jim's voice in this like terrible dialect, he's also doing Huck Finn's voice in a dialect.
Yeah, because he does multiple different dialects. I mean, that is a really genuinely very interesting thing about the book. It's like multiple different registers of language.
Yeah, and he highlights that in a little prefatory note about how not everybody speaks the same, and he's going to reflect that in his book, and he sure does it. I first tried to read Huck Finn when I was maybe 8 years old to write a book report about it for school, and I had like a normal, unabridged version of it. And I did not make it 3 pages in before just hitting a wall with his incomprehensible dialect. Mm-hmm. And it was the first time that had ever happened to me as a precocious little kid. Yeah. I was like, oh no, I physically can't read this. And I just broke down. Like, I think I cried about the fact that I couldn't get through this book. I know that I read it as a young adult many years later, but when I reread it this time, I could not remember any details. Like, I knew the iconic moments. I knew about the raft. I knew about they meet two people, the Duke and Dauphin, two pretenders to nobility later on. But I knew that happened. I could not remember anything about them, including I could not remember just how unpleasant they are and how long they stick around.
Do you think that kind of selective memory, like, what do you think the reason for that is?
I'm not sure. And I really am not sure. I'm really baffled by this because I feel like I'm going to remember it going forward. But I don't know. I really kept doubting myself. Maybe I didn't read it, but I strongly remember that I chose to read it. I remember being on the New York City subway reading it. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Yeah. No, it's a super weird book, in contradistinction to Tom Sawyer, right? Where it's like sort of very episodic and it's playful. And, there are some like really dark and creepy aspects of it. Like the portrayal of Injun Joe, this one character that's like incredibly dark. I remember being deeply freaked out by that as a child, just like how he dies and all that stuff. Like that was awful. But like there's this playful kind of effervescent quality to it that as a kid I remember being really captured by. And like the Becky Thatcher subplot, was something that as a little girl, right, I really enjoyed that, right? Because she's like this sort of they have this like, I don't know, schoolroom kind of romance, right? Her and Tom Sawyer. But then, he's always getting in trouble, he's getting in fights, he's like running away, he's playing hooky, he's doing all this stuff. And then at one point in the book, they go off together and they got lost in these caves. And like, I really appreciated the fact that she like went off and got in all this trouble. And it must have been because me as a child, I mean, it's not that I got in all that much trouble, but I used to make friends for whatever reason with the really bad boys in school. Those were always the ones that I was really good friends with. And so I was just like, as a child, I was like, oh, this book is so good because it like it was in keeping with that whole vibe that I was really like, enjoying the bad boys.
Well, and if you like bad boys, I mean, Tom Sawyer's a really interesting bad boy because he's also a desperate romantic.
Yeah, and like full of like imagination and doing crazy stuff.
And he's addicted to reading, and he's Don Quixote, right? He's influenced by everything he reads, and he wants everything to be according to the rules and rituals laid out in adventure books.
Yeah, so that the vibe of that, like I really responded to it. And in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer.
The Adventures, that one's got the
Yeah. The character of Huck Finn, is in that book, and he's really odd, and he's kind of. I remember when I was reading that book as a child, just thinking he was really odd, and then reading it, rereading it, not all of it, but parts of it just now, it struck me as like so sad and pathetic. Like his father's around, his mother's not, and his father's a drunk, and so no one takes care of him, and the clothes he wears are basically rags. And in the book, because it's told from this kind of, it's the third person narrative, but it's told in this kind of exuberant voice, you see it as adventurous. He's the first one to go barefoot when the spring comes, and he's the last one to start putting on heavier clothes when the wintry weather comes. And like, that's kind of fun from a childlike perspective, but it's kind of like dark, when you think about, like who's feeding this kid, like what is happening.
And that gets amplified in Adventures of Huck Finn, where because not only are we getting it from his perspective, but we're also getting more details about some of the terrible things that are happening. I mean, he's got an abusive father. At the end of Tom Sawyer, for reasons, both Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn end up fabulously wealthy, and eventually Huck's dad finds out about it and tries to find his son so he can get some of that money so he can drink it away.
And it becomes quite violent, right?
And becomes incredibly violent. He's very abusive because, of course, I mean, not really because he's a sort of person who would be violent because that's all he knows. But, it's presented as, well, you think you're so much better than me. I'm going to take you down. I need to feel superior to you. So it's very perceptive in some ways, it feels like, about some of the dynamics of an abusive parent. Yeah, it gets real dark. Both of the books get really dark at times. They're both not kid-friendly books as we think of such things today.
No.
But absolutely, Huck Finn is not a kid-friendly book.
Yeah, what made you decide to read it just now?
Well, I'll get to that in a moment. But I want to talk right now a little bit more about the book first, because the why I decided to read it is a little more complicated. So you've probably read a few things about it, and so you're probably not going to fall for you're probably not going to fall for this little trick I'm going to try to play right now. But what do you think the overall plot of this book is?
Well, I think it's got to do with how do you get free, right? Because Huckleberry Finn wants to get away from the environment. He specifically wants to get away from this abusive dad, right? But also more generally, like that whole town life is just not doing it for him. And Jim, just wants to get free, right? But paradoxically, they're not heading toward a place of greater freedom, right? They're heading south on the river, right?
Exactly. I mean, not intentionally at first.
But
yes.
You know what I mean? So it's like the path is not a direct one to any kind of freedom, right? It's at best a very indirect kind of path.
Yes, that's a good reading of it. The reading that I found a lot of people saying, as I was just looking online for what people think about this book, is that quite a lot of people who've read the book and who are writing this immediately after reading the book think that this is a tale about Huck learning that slavery is bad and that Jim is a person.
Oh.
And neither of these are true.
Why do you think people want to see that, though? Actually, perhaps that's a rhetorical question.
Exactly. I mean, it's very much about oh yes, now slavery is done and we can neatly file it away because of this image. And it's like, oh, wow. So I want to unpack this because I hadn't realized just how not about that this book is. So, all right, does Huck learn that slavery is bad? Well, throughout the book, Huck is torn between helping who he considers and his society considers to be Jim's legal owner, Miss Watson, and helping Jim, who he knows and has had a relationship for a while. He's not a big fan of Miss Watson. She's a bit annoying to him. But he has been raised by a father and in a society that is very clear that, like, you can't, it's not so much that it's pro-slavery, it's that it's anti-slavery. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Anti-slavery, that's like suspicious behavior. You're not going to, no, you can't be that. That would be wrong. He doesn't really think about whether slavery is wrong. He very much thinks that being anti-slavery is wrong.
Because this book is published a couple decades after the Civil War, but it's meant to be the world before the Civil War, right?
It's written after the Civil War, and it's taking place beforehand, exactly, which is an interesting position to be writing such a book from. So, there's a big, long, dark night of his soul passage where Huck has to decide once and for all whether he's going to help Jim or not, and he decides to help Jim, and he says, this famous line, "All right, then I'll go to hell." And it's very rallying, but he still doesn't really think that being anti-slavery is a good thing. Shortly afterwards, through ludicrous fiction, Tom Sawyer shows up way down the Mississippi, and Jim has been caught, and Huck asks Tom to help him free Jim, and Tom agrees almost immediately, and Huck is shocked. This is scandalizing that Tom would agree to free a slave without needing a lot of convincing or buttering up. So, no, at no point in this book has Huck learned that slavery is bad. He's just willing to help this one particular slave, if so to speak. And on the other hand, does Huck learn that Jim is, a real person? He does a little bit. He sort of realizes that Jim is actually sad about his family being left behind and worrying about him. He eventually realizes that maybe he shouldn't pull quite so many pranks on Jim. He always was a little bit better to Jim than some of the other people were. He doesn't dehumanize them, as much as everybody else does. But even by the end of the book, there's this whole long, terrible ending section where he asks Tom to help free Jim. And Tom, being Tom, comes up with this elaborate plan that requires weeks and weeks of preparation. And at the last minute, he tells people that this is going to happen so that they can try to stop them. And it all goes terribly. And Tom gets shot in the leg, which makes him very happy. And
adventure.
And Jim doesn't actually get away. And it's just awful. And none of it had to happen because the reason Tom agreed was because he knew that Miss Watson had died and freed Jim.
Oh, geez.
So this is several weeks of torturing them. They're like, "Oh, there aren't enough rats and bugs in your cell. We're going to have to bring some in." Jim is just like, "What are you doing?"
But it's a game for them, right? It's a game.
It's absolutely a game for them. And Tom is a good enough boy that when it's all over, he gives Jim $40. Say, "Thank you for letting us do that. That was very nice of you." I don't know what that's about. That's a weird result. It's so strange. It's such a strange ending and such a strange book. But it is, I just don't think you can easily say that Huck learns as much as a lot of people want to read into that, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, well, they want to see some kind of like you said, a reassuring story of some kind of moral growth, right? And the world is okay at the end, but it doesn't sound like it's okay to me.
No. And I don't think it's okay to Mark Twain either, right? And I think this is the advantage that he gets from having Huck tell the story. Because Huck can be a lot worse and he can present a lot more prejudice and he can have a more complicated take than Twain is going to have, I guess is sort of what I'm saying. And you're sort of able to dissect some of the mentality, some of the, Huck thinks of Jim as being incredibly superstitious, but Huck and Tom, as you might recall from Tom Sawyer, are also incredibly superstitious.
Insanely so. They're constantly doing these crazy charms and weird rituals, and it's just, all the time.
Exactly. So but Huck reads that differently when he sees Jim doing anything. And we can see that. That, I think, is made, but it's never as explicit as you want it to be, right? You kind of want, Jim talking in this terrible dialect, being all, "I don't know anything. I'm so scared. Misunderstanding what's going on occasionally." You want there to be some sort of winking nod that Jim isn't as terrible as Huck is presenting him. Terrible in the sense of being foolish or being stereotypy as Huck is presenting him as. But I don't know. I didn't see any signs of that. Maybe scholars have found more. And I'm not saying that Twain needed to do that. It's just interesting. I don't know. It's a really complicated book that way.
Yeah. I mean, as you're describing it, I'm thinking kind of two things. One of the things I'm thinking about is the ways in which there are certain, you could say there's movies as well as books, right? Certain ones that age really well in the sense that they're kind of fresh and they become something new and different being read in different generations over time. Like, I don't mean to make that sound like they're not perfect books, but they're books that are very like perennial kind of in the sense that they flourish in different kinds of reading settings. And then there's books that like, they just land funny in a different time. And I feel like this is like that, where you can kind of look at it as a historical artifact. You could say, well, what was it trying to do in its time? How has it been read? What are the kind of ways in which people have read it to certain kinds of ends? But it's really hard to have it be fresh in that kind of way where you can use it. And the other thing maybe kind of related to that I'm thinking about is like, in what sense is this children's literature? You know, we've talked about children's literature before, like remember we did Harriet the Spy and we've read other children's things as well. And we thought a lot about like, what is it that makes literature either children's literature or YA literature? Like what is that space that it inhabits? And these two books, Huck Finn especially, but also I'm thinking a little bit about Tom Sawyer, are children's literature. And like I was describing reading Tom Sawyer as a kid and like what I was getting out of as a kid and getting a lot of satisfaction in some ways, right, as a kid. And yet they're like, I would never in a million years give either one of these books to my children. You know, I'm like, I mean, if they read it, I'd be like, that's fine. But I wouldn't be like, oh, this is great. You should read this.
Yeah. And Mark Twain agrees, right? Like he has a note in Huck Finn about these books are not for children. And if you're giving them to a kid or you're upset that children shouldn't be reading this, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, but like, what is the purpose then of writing it where it's in children's voices? Or, you know, at least this one is in a child's voice. And even in Tom Sawyer, like there's this, I don't know, childish affect kind of like you take pleasure in the play.
Well, I think for Tom Sawyer, it's trying to tug at nostalgia, right? It's let's remember what it used to be like. And I think for Huck Finn, like, I feel like he's doing it from a child's point of view because it allows him to depict certain things that he might have difficulty depicting if he wrote it from a neutral point of view or from his current point of view. He'd have to address certain things in a way, perhaps, that might come off, that might distract from the points he's trying to make, even if they are the points he's trying to make, right? Like, if you have to address the fact that the Civil War has happened.
Yeah.
That's not going to maybe go as well with this book. Plus, you know, occasionally Huck Finn phrases things in an interesting way. Like, it's clear that Twain is enjoying playing with this dialectical speech. He's probably also enjoying playing with Jim's, but he doesn't do a good job with that. But Huck's, which seems like something that's a little closer to home for him, he gets to have Huck say all sorts of weird and fun twistings of language, which, you know, are sometimes too much and are sometimes just right. And I don't know, for all the weirdness and for as much as I hate the second half of the book, basically, once the Duke and Dauphin show up, they're just awful characters and I wanted them to go away. And then when they went away, we ended up in the final section of the book where Tom Sawyer tortures Jim. And it's like, no, this is worse. This is somehow worse. But right before they show up, we have a really beautiful chapter. It's chapter 19, and it's got a beautiful section about what the days are like as they're floating down the river. And I'm just going to read a little bit of it because I think it's kind of lovely. We sat down on the sandy bottom where the water was about knee-deep and watched the daylight come. Not a sound anywheres, perfectly still. Just like the whole world was asleep. Only sometimes the bullfrogs a-cluttering, maybe. The first thing to see looking away over the water was a kind of dull line. That was the woods on t'other side. You couldn't make nothing else out. Then a pale place in the sky. Then more paleness spreading around. Then the river softened up a way off and weren't black any more, but gray. You could see little dark spots drifting along ever so far away, trading scows and such things, and long black streaks, rafts. Sometimes you could hear a sweep squeaking or jumbled up voices. It was so still, and sounds come so far, and by and by, you could see a streak on the water, which you know by the look of the streak that there's a snag there and a swift current which breaks on it and makes that streak look that way. And you see the mist curl right up off the water, and the east reddens up into the river, and you make out a log cabin in the edge of the woods away on the... It goes on. Like, this is all one sentence, and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
And it's even more gorgeous because it is still coming from Huck's voice. So you get a sense, you get an even more in-depth sense of that kind of romanticism that we saw in Tom. But it comes from like looking at the world around him rather than thinking about the things that he's already read and reprocessing the world through that. It's, I don't know, that's a really lovely chapter, I have to say.
It is interesting. And you can see how readers who are trying to kind of, I don't know, understand the character of Huck Finn in a, I don't know, you want to call it like redemptive kind of way. You were talking about this in terms of like, does he learn that slavery is bad or whatever? I mean, maybe part of what they're responding to, and this is actually way more interesting than that redemptive reading, is that he's connected to the natural world in a certain kind of way.
Yeah.
Right. And it's complicated to talk about that because it's done to a certain extent through, I don't know if you want to say demonizing or like treating Native people and Black people in a, I don't know, I don't want to say abject kind of way, but like in a sort of push to the edges kind of way, in order to make space for this kind of, I don't know, maybe new American hero. I wonder if that's the kind of reading that's coming from. But it's a gorgeous passage though. Like there's no question about it.
Yeah. I think that Huck Finn is a more interesting character than the strictly redemptive sort of, making him out to be the hero that we want him to be kind of version that people sometimes present. I think he's more interesting than that. I think the book is a hard read for a lot of reasons, but I think there are moments like that which really are beautiful. And I'm not sure I would recommend that people read the book, but if you do, there will be stuff that might be worth it for you. I don't know. I'm glad I read it and I'm thinking about it, but it's never going to be one of my favorite books.
No.
Let me put it that way. Now, you'd asked me a while ago why I read this book.
Like why now? Yeah.
Why now? And I'll tell you why now. And it has to do with the other conversation we had earlier. Over at the website, lithub.com, we'll have a link to this in the show notes, they put out, as they have been doing for many years, the best books of the year list, which compiles all the other publications' best books of the year's list into one mega list, so to speak. So this is looking at 69 different lists from 39 different outlets, which recommended, it says here, more than 12,000 individual books.
So in case your reading list is not long enough, this is the cure for that, right?
Exactly. So these are the 90 books that made it onto 5 or more lists. And one book made it very much at the top of the list, to an extent that the person who compiles the list says, I've never seen a book run away with this list like Percival Everett's novel, James, which got 33. It was on 33 lists. The next highest was on 21 lists. That's quite a jump. This was the book of 2024. It was the most, talked about, prestigious. It had the biggest buzz, something like that. It feels like it's kind of an event. And I had seen it about. I'd seen it on display at bookstores and so forth. And I knew that it was Adventures of Huck Finn told from Jim's point of view.
Is it also in the first person?
It is also in the first person. Now, have you read these novels that are looking at a classic piece of literature and retelling it from a different character's point of view?
Yeah, to some extent. Like there's been, there's been reworkings of like the Odyssey and stuff like that. Like most famously, Margaret Atwood's I can't even say it.
Penelope Atwood.
There you go. I'm not going to try to say it. Which I read part of. I didn't read the whole thing. I didn't get really taken in by it. There's
no, I did not care for that book at all.
No, there's Wide Sargasso Sea, which is kind of responding to, and I read part of that. And I was like, maybe I'll go back to it. So I kind of have a sense of the genre.
Yeah, and there was Madeline Miller's Circe, which I thought was okay.
Yeah, that was okay.
But I generally, I don't know, I had seen that and I thought, oh, I know what this book is going to do, and I'm sure it's fine. But there's something about that which kind of doesn't appeal to me for whatever reason. It feels like it would you'd be able to hit the right notes sort of to do reparations maybe too easily and be too pat. I don't know. That was sort of what I was worried about and maybe put me off it, which maybe was unfair. But I finally decided, you know what, maybe I'll give it a try. And if I like it, I can talk about it on the podcast. And we're talking about it, so I must have liked something about it. Because that's actually kind of not what's going on in the book at all. You imagine, now I haven't read Wide Sargasso Sea, but I tend to think that these kinds of books are sort of, either they're happening like before or after the time of the original piece of fiction.
Yeah, they're trying to give you, I mean, in some ways, I guess you kind of associate them with the kinds of things that happen in fan fiction, right? Because they're trying to give you the part of a character's life that is underdeveloped in the canonical work, right? To sort of give you that backstory or whatever.
Right. And so I expected James, the novel, to kind of fit into the spaces of Twain's novel, but that's not what's happening. James is its own thing. The book starts with more or less the same plot setup, but we are slowly given clues that actually this is a bit different. And this is going to be some spoilers, by the way. So if you want to go read James, skip ahead to the next chapter mark, and you can listen to the other half of this episode, because it's kind of a fun book to read if you don't fully know what's going to happen. But as I was saying, we find out that this isn't quite the same book. Of course, Jim goes by James when he's talking to the people he trusts, the people who aren't white. And it turns out James is very educated. He's learned to read and write. He reads the books in Judge Thatcher's library and so forth. And he teaches this to the other black children in town, how to read and write. And he also teaches them how to survive under a system of slavery, how to speak with the, quote, correct, incorrect grammar in order to appease white people, and how to tell white people what's going on and what they should do while making them think that they thought of it on their own and that you, of course, would never be able to think of it and all of that. Like, it's the first couple of chapters just lay all that out, and it's amazing.
So there's like one way of speaking that he uses to speak to particularly white people, and then there's his own voice, right? Which is very different.
Yes, exactly. Very, very different. So that feels like it maybe could fit into Twain's world, maybe. We get a little bit further along in the story, and James mentions at some point that he finds it weird when Huck uses the N-word. Which is ridiculous if you've just read Twain's novel, because he uses that word all the time. Oh, my word. And so they're like, wow, he said that. That's not like him. It's like, yes, what are you talking about? Of course it's like, what do you? And then you find out that the name of the town, the town where Tom Sawyer lives, is not St. Petersburg like it is in Twain's novels. It's Hannibal.
Oh, interesting. Which is where Mark Twain is from, right?
Which is where Mark Twain is from. And then the plot starts taking even more of a dramatic shift after the Duke and Dauphin show up. Again, these pretenders who are there to sort of harass Huck and Jim for quite a long section of the book. Well, Everett just makes these characters even worse, just pushes them further and further and makes them truly despicable and atrocious and hard to read, but they don't last as long. And then the plot just absolutely changes course, and James gets away from everybody, including Huck, and goes off on his own thing. And like the entire end of the novel just doesn't happen here.
Yeah, wow.
And then we learn that all of this is happening on the brink of the Civil War. So this has been set forward in time quite a bit. So we're not getting like this new version of the novel. We're getting a different novel that's playing with some of the same characters and ideas that Twain was playing with, but reformulating them in a very different way to a very different end.
Wow.
And you also might think, well, okay, the point of this kind of a book is to give us like, in a fan fiction way, like to allow us to emotionally connect with Jim more, because we only sort of see him through Huck's eyes, and Huck's eyes cannot be trusted when it comes to Jim too much. So maybe now we'll get the interiority of James as we're going about, but that's also not what the book is. So Percival Everett, it writes little weird philosophical novels, it turns out.
Did you look into any of his other things that he's written?
I did. I've just started one. I'm about halfway through it now. It's a book called I Am Not Sidney Poitier, in which the character, not Sidney Poitier, goes through life with the name not Sidney. He looks more like Sidney Poitier than Sidney Poitier does. He, as the point I'm right now in the book, he's attending college and he's taking a class from a professor named Percival Everett, the author of the book, who is giving a philosophy of nonsense course where he's constantly talking about like categories and how they rub up against each other and how contradictions sort of inhabit each other.
Well,
and
that's excellent.
It's just incredibly playing with that. It's a lot of fun. It's also a very funny book. James is similar. This is a briskly told philosophical novel. I sat down to read it one night thinking I'll start it and I'll finish it tomorrow, or maybe I'll keep reading it tomorrow and it'll take a few days. But no, I read it in one sitting. I was up real late that day. I read it in less than 5 hours. That was really fun. And it was also interested in these kinds of category tension, the correct, incorrect grammar, the you gotta act stupid to be smart mindset that the book shows early on. And then it gets into more complications about like, who's passing for white? What does that mean? What relationships might they have with their perceived or their legally appointed ethnicity? Like, what are the ethics when you're dealing with somebody who doesn't perceive you as human? Who do you kill and who do you let live? Things like that. Like, it's really using these systems, there's some emotional content, but that's like grazed upon the meat of it, so to speak, is setting up these contexts where you highlight interesting problems with the systemic ideas. It's really interesting on that level. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, absolutely recommend this book.
It sounds very tempting.
I think I'm not Sidney Poitier a little bit more because it's a little bit funnier and a little bit lighter, even though it does go some very dark places.
We'll have to hear more about it when you finish reading the whole thing.
I suppose so. But yeah, so that's why I read Huck Finn, because I wanted to see if I wanted to read this other book, and I wanted to have context for it. And I don't know if you need to read Huck Finn in order to read this book.
But it made it different from what it would have been without it, I think, it sounds like.
I'm definitely glad I had a refresher, yeah. And Percival Everett, likes Huck Finn, even though he sees problems with it. Like, apparently he read the book, like, I don't know, I forget the number, 16 times in a row.
Mm-hmm.
And then he put it down, and then he wrote James without looking at the novel again.
Oh, interesting.
Because he wanted it, like the rhythms and things to be internalized, but he didn't want that to over-determine what he was writing. And I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think it shows in the final work in a good way.
The art of change-bringing is peculiar to the English, and like most English peculiarities, unintelligible to the rest of the world. To the ordinary man, in fact, the pealing of bells is a monotonous jangle and a nuisance. The change-ringer avers that where the hinder bells run 7-5-6, or 5-6-7, or 5-7-6, the music is always prettier. But what he really means is that by the English method of ringing with rope and wheel, each several bell gives forth her fullest and her noblest note. His passion, and it is a passion, finds its satisfaction in mathematical completeness and mechanical perfection, and as his bell weaves her way rhythmically up from lead to hinder place and down again, he is filled with the solemn intoxication that comes of intricate ritual faultlessly performed. So I've been rereading Dorothy Sayers' The Nine Tailors, and this is a book that I think stands in two very different places. One is it's one of a series of 11 novels that Dorothy Sayers wrote about this one particular detective character, Lord Peter Wimsey. And so sometimes I think it's very much seen in that context. But it also, I think, in a way that's different from all the other books in that series, kind of sits alone and sits outside as a novel about a particular place and time that has a very, very kind of, thick texture to it. So I find that quality really fascinating. I thought it would be fun to talk about together and fun to go back and reread the book. I hadn't reread it for a while. And the other thing that is kind of neat about the book, and I thought you might find kind of enchanting, is it's all about bell ringing. And bell ringing in terms of what's technically called campanology, that is the study of how to ring changes on bells. So it's the mathematical permutations. So if you have 6 bells, there's a certain number of variations that you can have. If you have 8 bells, it's another number of variations. And there are different patterns that can be used to create the variations. So it's wild. Anyways, there's a lot to say about that. And should I say a little bit about Dorothy Sayers?
Sure.
So she is kind of like a weirdly fascinating figure, I have to say. Born in 1893, died in 1957. And she wrote a lot of stuff, but she's best known for these mystery novels, this series of mystery novels and short stories centered on this one character. She was born in Oxford and then brought up in East Anglia in Fen country, which is a very particular kind of landscape. And I mention that because she's extraordinarily good at creating a sense of a specific place. And you see this East Anglian Fen country in the Nine Tailors, and we might talk about that a little bit. But also, she has one of her other novels in this series called Gaudy Night. It's set in Oxford, and again, it has a very, very textured sense of the place. So I like that quality of her writing a lot. So she also wrote some other things too. She did a 3-volume translation of Dante's Divine Comedy, which I have to say is kind of terrible. At least, I mean, I really wanted to like it when I ran across it because I'd read her novels and I like really liked them, and I thought, oh, and I like Dante too, so surely her translations they're terrible. And she also wrote like a certain amount of devotional kinds of stuff, including this one book, which is actually a series of plays. It's called The Man Born to Be King. Famous broadcast plays on the life of Christ that were put on as radio plays in 1941 and 1942. And I was actually thinking about this earlier today. I'm like, why is it? She's such a good writer, and then she writes these things where you're like, how somebody you become embarrassed for somebody, like you feel embarrassed and it's because you're embarrassed for them. I feel like that about those. And I think it's because her writing is incredibly witty and it's got this playful quality to it. Like even where it's kind of dark and heavy as it is, at certain parts of like the Nine Tailors, it's still extremely witty. And, when people are writing about God, they're not funny.
Usually. Sometimes.
She's 100% not funny. And so I'm like, oh man.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I don't mean to be negative, but like, I don't enjoy those. But the novels are fantastic. And she wrote a whole bunch of them. And the Nine Tailors, like I said, it kind of sits on its own. And it's one of the later ones she wrote. It came out in 1934. And she writes these novels between 1923 and 1937, right? Had you ever heard of these novels? Or like, I'm pretty sure you haven't read them, but had you heard about them from anybody?
I have heard about them, and I've never read them. No, I don't really know much about the main character, Peter Wimsey. I don't have him as an archetype like I have with Sherlock Holmes or with Poirot. So what's he like?
Yeah, this is actually a really interesting question because it changes over time. Like the first, I don't know, half dozen maybe of the novels is like a kind of slightly flat character. He's an aristocrat. He's somebody who has experienced what is described in the novels as shell shock, like during World War I. So he's nervy, right? That's the word that gets used. And he's kind of comes off as like effete and, like a caricature of a effete upper class person. But he's actually very clever, and part of it is performative. He's an extremely performative character. And this becomes manifested in all kinds of interesting ways throughout the books in increasingly complex ways. And I think one of the places it really flowers, which again is one of my other favorite ones in the series, is one that's called Murder Must Advertise that came out in 1933. So actually just before the Nine Tailors. And that's set in an advertising agency. And he's literally performing the whole way through because he's pretending to be somebody different to work at this ad agency to investigate a murder that's taken place there. So he's literally throughout much of the book pretending to be someone other than he is. And then there's a whole sequence within it where that character is pretending to be someone else. So you know what I mean? So it becomes really folded in on itself in a really neat kind of way.
Yeah.
And also the other thing that's awesome about Murder Must Advertise is it's set in an ad agency, and she actually worked in an ad agency. So she went to Oxford, did really well. She was a specialist in medieval French. Shout out medieval French, right?
Sure.
Got a first on her exams, did really well, but Oxford didn't award degrees to women at that time. So she didn't get one, but then later they retrospectively did it. I know.
Sure.
I know.
Was it after she died or not?
No, it was after. It was in 1920. She's one of the first ones to file the paperwork. She's like, give me my damn degree.
Oh, okay.
And she worked as a teacher in France for a bit, and then she worked in an ad agency for like 8 years. And so she knows that world really well, and it's crazy. Actually, I was rereading Murder Must Advertise while watching Mad Men on TV a couple weeks ago, and I was like, really satisfying. The kind of like some things never change. There are some things that are just very perennial. And like, so again, she's really good at the texture of places, whether it's landscapes or whether it's like a particular line of work, right? In Murder Must Advertise. And that's why the Nine Tailors has this really interesting quality, because the landscape is vivid, but also like the bells are totally like another character.
Yeah.
Which I know sounds crazy, but it's absolutely true.
I mean, from the passage that you read, that absolutely sounds like what's going on. So I know nothing much except that it exists, that campanology exists and is a thing. So the murder, is it one of the bell ringers who dies? Is that what the idea is?
It's actually, I'm going to try really hard not to spoil the plot. I think it's really worth
it. You're making it tempting. I might want to read this one, so I don't want to be too spoiled going into it.
Honest to God, I think you do. So there's two things going on with the bells. One thing that's happening with the bells is that it's kind of a driver of the mystery plot. Like the bells end up being really important in terms of understanding what's happened with a particular mysterious death. right? So, and then also a theft that had taken place decades before that sort of comes to light again in the context of the death, right? So the bells are really important for that. And then it turns out that understanding how the bell ringing works, how change ringing works, allows you to do, among other things, produce a code that lets you tell somebody else who can also know something about how bells ring, figure it out, and get the goods that they want to get. Anyway, so that's driving the plot in that kind of way. But the other thing that's happening with the bells in this novel is they're in this really metaphysical way structuring everything that happens. Like there's a kind of, I don't know, supernatural thing that's happening with the bells as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy. And so you see it in all kinds of interesting ways. And one of the ways you see it right away is in like the, I guess you would call it the superstructure of the novel. So just like right when you're facing the main title page, it says, change is rung on an old theme in 2 short touches and 2 full peals. So it's just like an epigraph kind of. And so as if the chapters are themselves bell ringing changes. And the table of contents carries that on. It's divided into sections that are different kinds of campanology methods, like different kinds of bell ringing techniques. So one's called A Short Touch of Kent Treble Bob Major, 2 courses. And then instead of chapters, it's the first course and the second course. And then a full peal of Grandsire triples, Holt's 10-part peal. And then there's 10 parts. And like, it may sound like kind of precious, but what it does is something very odd, because if you go into the parts, you can see that the people are bells. So like, for example, like this is just the superstructure, right? So for example, in this full peal of Grandsire triples, the first part is Mr. Go to Bed is called wrong with a double. And that's a particular movement of the bell in the ringing cycle. The second part is Lord Peter is called into the hunt. The hunt is, again, a way that the bell moves in a particular kind of phase of the change ringing. And it goes on. And the other sections do that too. So Will Thoday goes in quick and comes out slow. Nobby goes in slow and comes out quick. So basically it's like an allegory. Like the bells are like allegorical representations of the plot. It's so weird.
Now, does it go so far as to actually like structure when characters come in and go out based on the numerology of the bell ringing? Is
no,
that what's going on?
I wouldn't go that far, but what's going on there, and actually this kind of only dawned on me after I'd read this book a number of different times, is that it's a way of talking about fortune and providence, right? In other words, no, I swear to God, it's insane.
I'm sure. I don't know. This, okay.
Yeah.
How
well,
is this
like, so what it
connect?
is characters are doing things, right? And they're choosing their courses of action and things are happening, right? But this bell meta narrative kind of reminds you that you are and you aren't choosing where you go, right? Like you kind of also are running in your course, right?
Right.
And so like she never says any of that explicitly, but the table of contents is doing this weird thing even there. But like the book is very light and playful in the ways in which it talks about that. Like, it sounds really heavy and ponderous the way I'm describing it, but that's only if you start thinking about the superstructure of the book, because she doesn't say any of this explicitly. Instead, the bell ringing is done in this really like playful, crazy kind of way. Like she'll describe the ringing of the bells and she'll give you just these syllables to represent the bell sounds. Tin, tan, din, dan, bim, bam, bom, bo. Tan, tin, dan, din, bam, bim, bom, bom. Like stuff like that, like weird, playful things. And then at another point, she'll have this one clergyman who's a character in the book. He's writing out a touch of treble bob major. So he's writing out the numbers for the bells as you ring them. And he's doing it for this one of the ringers who's he's still learning. And so he says to Lord Peter Wimsey, he says, just one moment, I'm just pricking this little touch to show Wally Pratt how to do it. And then he's like, oh, so what's this foolish lad done here? Let me see. 5173246 15734286. That's the first, thirds, and fourths all right. And then it goes on and on. This like page is full of numbers. But then it gets like really playful. What's happened? To be sure, he's forgotten to make the bob. She can't come home until she's called. He ran a red ink line down the page and started to write figures furiously. There, 5137246 1537428 And now she comes home like a bird. And then he does some more numbers. Second to third, third to fifth, fourth to second, fifth to second, sixth to fourth, seventh to eighth, eighth to sixth for the plain lead, then the bob. Plain, bob, bob, 3 plain, and a bob. I cannot understand why red ink should distribute itself so lavishly over one's person. There, I have a large smear on my cuff. Collar in the middle, in and out, and home. Repeat twice. A lovely little touch. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah. So Peter Wimsey is like our familiar character and the outsider character who's going into this world and seeing these people do that? And is he like, you guys are crazy?
Well, no, because he providentially knows how to ring bells because
Of
he
course
learned
he
how to do it
does.
when he was a kid back at Duke's Denver. And the whole opening of the book sets this up. So he's driving to go visit friends at this other town. He drives the car accidentally off the road. He and his man, right, his servant, wander around until they find somewhere to stay, and they end up staying at the rectory with the local clergyman. And the clergyman is this guy who loves bells, has written books on ringing bells, and he's excited about tonight they're going to ring this magnificent 10-hour peal. He's got all the local guys trained in how to do it, and they're going to do this. They're going to achieve this incredible campanological feat. But then it turns out one of the guys who's supposed to ring can't because he's come down with influenza, with the flu, and he's dejected. But then, providentially, it turns out that Lord Peter Wimsey can ring bells. And so they get through it. And it's handled very lightly and playfully. And that's the whole opening scene. But that turns out to actually be an incredibly important event in terms of the murder plot. And I won't give it away, but like what's going on in that opening is kind of setting the stage. So, I mean, I guess it's hard to convey like how it's the numbers game, right? And you don't often see a novel, and especially like a playful light novel that is also playing the numbers game. And I ran into it actually when I was a kid. It was the first, that's how I found the series. It was because I was reading nonfiction. I was reading essays by Isaac Asimov on number. And in one of them, he mentions campanology. And he says, hey, there's this novel that's came out. I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. And so that was the first one I read. And then I don't think most people come to the series first through that book, but weirdly, that's how
Yeah, that's fascinating. Did this lead to you actually getting like otherwise interested in campanology?
No, I mean, I like numbers a lot.
Sure. Who doesn't?
Who doesn't, right? But no, I never. But like the whole idea of like number patterns, right? That's like absolutely fascinating. And I guess what it did was it was just like the numbers were the gateway into her books. And she's a beautiful writer. I mean, you know, you were talking about that lovely, lovely passage in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn about like this just meditatively kind of looking at the river and the banks and almost being outside of time. She has moments that produce something like that effect. There's this one moment. It's funny because it's a very plain moment in some ways, but it's absolutely hypnotic. This is driving in a car in the Fenlands, which is a very particular kind of landscape. High water table, prone to flooding, potentially very dreary and damp and cold, but also with a weird kind of austere kind of beauty to it. Anyway, so this one passage goes like this. Mile after mile, the flat road reeled away behind them. Here a windmill, there a solitary farmhouse, there a row of poplars strung along the edge of a reed-grown dike. Wheat, potatoes, beet, mustard, and wheat again. Grassland, potatoes, lucerne, wheat, beet, and mustard. A long village street with a gray and ancient church tower, a red brick chapel, and the vicarage set in a little oasis of elm and horse chestnut. And then once more dike and windmill, wheat, mustard, and grassland. Right? Like it's a very plain passage, but it's like it captures what a repetitive landscape looks like.
Well, and it's also changing, right? The permutations are still happening. The potatoes and the beet and the wheat are happening in different orders each time you come across them. So it's reflecting the hobby of this land, let's say.
Yeah. And so it's an absolutely fascinating story in all different kinds of ways. One aspect of it that leapt out to me, you will not be surprised to hear, because I hadn't read it for several years. I mean, I read it many times, but I haven't read it for a while, is like influenza is everywhere in this book. They're constantly talking about the flu. And I'm like, in a a semi-post-COVID world, I'm like, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And it's there right at the beginning of the novel. Like I told you, they run off the road, and the first house they find is a public house. Like it's a place where you could get a drink, but also stay over. But they can't stay there because the proprietor has influenza and his wife can't have guests at that time. Right. And the clergyman, the rector says, oh yeah, we're having tons, like everybody, it's all over the town. There's lots of it. And then that one bell ringer who can't work that first night that I mentioned, he's said to be struck down by this wicked scourge of influenza. And then there's somebody who dies like about a third of the way through the book, like a minor character, but it's influenza, so it's like, that's part of this world too, which is like really, I don't know, eerie.
Did it feel like the influenza was pointing towards other aspects of the book, or is it just this is a thing that was on the mind at the time?
I think it's Two things. One is that, I mean, it's just part of that world. But the other thing is, I think for that book, for this book in particular, for the Nine Tailors, it's part of the predictable unpredictability of life. In other words, things happen. There's this overarching, like, providential planning that's happening, that's guiding things in their courses. But on an everyday level, from where we sit in the world, like, stuff happens.
Oh.
So it's very much part of that. You really get that sense, especially when that one character dies that I mentioned.
So is, like, the campanology like a futile attempt to put order into the world?
Well, I mean, we read together Boethius, right?
Sure,
Like,
yeah.
right? So, like, you know how there's this idea that when you're in the world, it looks like fortune. Like, it looks just like shit happens. You're like, wow, I don't have no idea what just happened here. But Boethius says, if you stood outside, if you're looking at it from, like, a distance, from the God's perspective, you can see it's actually all hanging together as a kind of a sphere, and it's in order. I mean, it's a little bit of that kind of thing going on here. And I know it sounds crazy, but, like, her degree is in medieval French, okay? So, like, she totally read all this stuff, right?
Sure,
She loves Dante, right?
Yeah.
So, like, totally, I know she's thinking about this stuff. But the bells are the way she expresses that, because they run in their courses, right? They're circular, but you can't see the pattern except in glimpses. And so, like, the influenza, like running your car off the road, or any of these things, or what happens to some of the other characters, it looks chaotic, but it's actually coming out of a kind of orderly unfolding of events the way they need to happen. But the other thing is that, like, this is a world with influenza, because you see it. And I was kind of startled, because I went back and started reading a few of the other books in this series. It shows up there too. So in her first Peter Wimsey, her first novel comes out in 1923. It's called Whose Body? You will not be surprised there are a lot of Sherlock allusions, right? Because it's only 1923. So, like, this whole idea of Sherlock Holmes is like the paradigmatic detective. That's totally there. But also more influenza. There's a inquest going on, and the coroner comes in, and there's a discussion of influenza. It's like, the coroner, a medical man of precise habits and unimaginative aspect, arrived punctually, and looking peevishly around at the crowded assembly, directed that all the windows should be opened, thus letting in a stream of drizzling fog upon the heads of the unfortunates on that side of the room. Right? So open the windows, right? We've been doing that for a while. This caused a commotion and some expressions of disapproval, checked sternly by the coroner, who said that with the influenza about again, an unventilated room was a death trap, and anybody who chose to object to open windows had the obvious remedy of leaving the court. Right? And then there's, like, the scene goes on to, like, have a number of other little reminders of, like, what that's like. So this is just that world.
Yeah.
Right? They're just dealing with it.
Yeah. I mean, that's 1923, you said? That's just after the influenza epidemic, right?
Yeah, like 5 years later, right? Yeah, so they're still dealing with subsequent waves. So that was a bit weird.
That is a bit weird.
Well, you know what I mean? Like, I guess it's weird in the sense that I've read those books a million times. I never noticed those passages.
Right. And yet now that you've sort of gone through a somewhat similar event, you're like, oh, yeah, okay.
And now I'm like, whoa. Yeah, like, I totally am like, oh my God. It did not register in my mind at all.
One of the side effects of not really keeping up with the latest in what's happening in literature is that I don't know how COVID has made an impact in books over the last few years, especially, like, specifically getting mentioned in recent books. I know there are some books that were sort of written during COVID or engaging with what it was like to go through lockdown and so forth. I have seen reviews of books talking about that, but I haven't read any of them yet. So I don't really know, like, what the conversation, so to speak, has been about it in fiction. And, maybe I should, but, maybe I'll do it in 15 years and it'll be even more interesting.
Well, this is the thing, right? Like, on the one hand, it's obviously good to keep up with books that come out, like to have fields, have areas, whether it's, literature or whether it's movies or whatever, like, so you kind of have your finger on the pulse of what's going on. But there's also this other kind of satisfaction that comes from reading things or watching movies, right, that are really layered in time. So when you're watching it or reading it, you're also thinking about history, but also kind of imaginatively inhabiting a different, like, worldview. I mean, you're always inhabiting a different worldview, like whether it's something very contemporary or not, but there's something else happening the farther apart you're separated in time from it. And I don't know, that also is incredibly pleasurable.
Well, I think I might just add yet another book to my to-read pile.
I think you'd actually like it. Honestly, it's really well written.
No, it sounds very, very promising. But we should probably just, talk about anything that's coming up that we're excited about or anything else that's going on before we head off. I should report that follow-up from last month when we talked that I have now read Jared's book.
Oh, good.
Our friend Jared over at By the Bywater, Jared Pikacek, had his first novel come out last year called The West Passage, and I can now attempt to describe it a little bit more accurately, but it is a weird book in a delightful way. It's a fantasy novel that takes place in like this collapsing huge palace with 5 towers and 5 ladies ruling the towers, and some young people sort of have to go on a quest and explore it. Like we see different parts of this complex through their eyes, and we get to learn about things that they don't know about because everything's been in disarray for quite a long time. And it's a really interesting book. There's so many really vivid moments and lots of really fun attention to language. It does that thing where there are sort of little chapters that are in kind of different voices representing things from within the world, or, oh, this one chapter is written in sort of like a blank verse play kind of thing. It reminded me at certain points, not in terms of its content or even in terms of like mouthfeel, but in terms of its ambition for trying to include a bunch of different stuff. It a little reminded me of Moby Dick, that kind of thing, where you got a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
That's so cool. Yeah, no, that's what I was guessing, right? Because of like the different genres that are all embedded within it. Yeah, that's so cool.
And there's even a really delightful explicit allusion to Moby Dick at one point, which I quite enjoyed, but I'm not going to spoil any further here. And I without going too much more into it, because I want people to be pleasantly surprised if they pick it up. But one of the things that I really loved about the book was that it keeps telling you about things. It uses words for things that you think you understand. And then 20 pages later, a few more details will be described about the thing. And it's like, oh no, this is something completely different. We're just using an ordinary word for something. Like, I think there's one that early on we have a lantern, and it turns out this is more of a vehicle, but it still glows. But it's like, it's just not quite what you would have expected from that. And this defamiliarization of language in the world just keeps happening. And it's one of the most, for me, quite pleasurable, I can imagine for some people, quite irritating things about the book. But I really enjoyed how it kept me at sea. So I'm glad I finally read it.
That sounds really pleasurable. If you had to put it in a genre, like I'm imagining, like say you work in a bookstore and you're figuring out where to put it, where would you put it?
Oh, it's very much in fantasy, sci-fi type stuff. It's definitely a fantasy book. It's coming out of the tradition that isn't Lord of the Rings, because Jared has the Tolkien podcast here. That's coming out of Gormenghast and that tradition, as well as a few other things. But, that's still fantasy. It's just a mode of fantasy that we don't think of as primarily as we think of sort of post Lord of the Rings fantasy, perhaps.
Well, what I've been doing recently, and I expect to be doing actually a lot of it next week because my son John is going to be home for a bit, and so that means it's movie time. And I was up visiting in Boston last weekend, and one of the things we did is watch this movie called Funny Games. It's from 1997, and the reason I'm describing it is, first of all, it was incredibly interesting, but the reason I'm describing it is we came upon it in an odd kind of way. He's doing a course that's on film violence, and in some ways that seems like, yeah, great, fascinating topic, but it's turned out to be like really hard, like emotionally really hard to watch some of these things.
Sure.
And so we watched this together, partly because it's like, it's just hard to watch these things. Do you know what I mean? Like,
so you want support when you watch them, or
yeah, right. So this one, it was like absolutely fascinating in a number of ways, but one of the ways it was fascinating is the violence. You don't see the violence on screen. The violence takes place off screen or kind of at the periphery of the screen. So it's kind of there and not there, and it's embedded within this odd plot where there's a couple and their child who it's a German film, right? So they're in the German countryside. They go off to spend some time in this like summer house, and seemingly innocuous things happen. A couple of strangers coming to the door and engaging them in conversation and so on that seem innocuous but rapidly turn out to be dangerous, but not in a like obvious house invader takeover kind of way, but in a really uncanny kind of way. And the violence unfolds in this way that makes you feel on edge, but also confused through a lot of it. And so it's a very strange film because it makes you feel uncomfortable, but it holds you right at the edge of watchability and not watchability. So I don't know if that makes it, I don't know how that makes it sound, but it's really fascinating.
It makes it sound like it's not a movie for me, but that still sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's intellectually incredibly fascinating in the way it's put together, because what ends up basically happening is there's one kind of film, one kind of trajectory that family is on through the movie. And then the two strangers who've come to the house are almost as if they're in a different film. And it's that jarring, it's that disjunction between the tragedy of the family and the almost like farce of the invaders, that creates this unsettled sense. It's a very weird, but it's not everybody's cup of tea, obviously, but it's really interesting.
Do you read a lot of books about movies?
Occasionally I'll read a little something here and there. Often if I've seen a film that I really liked, I'll poke around and look for interviews with the director or things that so little bits and pieces here and there to get especially, and if I find a director whose work I like, I'll watch other things by the same director.
Oh, yeah. But like film criticism or I don't know, academic stuff about film, anything like that?
A little bit, just here and there. And it's very vicarious, right? Because my son is really in that world. So I'll often be like, oh, that was a good film. Did you read anything about it? And I'll sort of piggyback on it. Yeah. But I really, I love film. I didn't go down that path, but I can imagine an alternative universe where instead of books, it was movies. I can totally imagine that.
Yeah. I say that just because I've been reading a few books about music lately, about jazz and histories of jazz and things like that. And,
interesting.
Yeah, just as a way of thinking about jazz, etc. It's been interesting, but I don't know. I haven't done that as much with movie stuff outside of a few books here or there. And so just curious if you had anything like that.
Well, just from my very limited vicarious experience of piggybacking on John's reading and the things I find interesting tend to be things that are written by either cinematographers or directors and so on. It's not that you can take them as telling the truth about what they're doing, but they say interesting things. And a lot of the film criticism, I'm eh.
Because of my other podcast, I end up reading a lot of memoirs of directors who have not the best films, I don't know, Roger Corman types. And those are really interesting as well, because the people who make a lot of B movies have big personalities usually. And you also maybe shouldn't trust everything they say to be 100% true, but it's okay. You know what you're getting into, and it can be a very fun ride. I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we need all different kinds of directors.
Well, that about wraps things up for this month. If you'd like to get in touch with us, listeners, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm. We'd always love to hear from you, and we're also on Blue Sky, so look for us there. This show is made possible by people like you supporting us on Patreon, and patrons get to hang out with us in a friendly Discord. Find out more at patreon.com/megaphonic. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/79. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
See you again at the Spouter-Inn.